Hi everyone, this is Jim. Welcome to this postmortem of my Blitz game number 945. I had the white pieces and started off with d4. My opponent went e6, an interesting move. You can see it's the third choice here after d5 and knight f6. Knight f6 the top choice and d5 the second choice. Both very flexible mainline moves, d5 going for some kind of queen's gambit declined often, and knight f6 going for Nimzo Indian or a king's Indian or a Grinfeld, those kind of positions. But e6 has a completely different idea in mind. And there's two different ways that this game can proceed from here. White could continue with the e4 and black could play d5. And then black would have the French defense. Or as in the game, I can play c4 and black can play f5, and black will have the Dutch defense. So if black is willing to learn the French defense and the Dutch defense, this is a system that you can use against both e4 and d4, because the French defense can also be played against the e4 move. Anyway, besides playing f5 in this position, black could also just decide to transpose back into a queen's gambit declined with d5, or go for a Nimzo Indian with knight f6. So it's a very flexible way to play, and but f5 is black's intent in this game, going for the Dutch defense. So I went with g3, which is the main move, and here he goes knight f6, and I go bishop g2. So we've all followed the main line up until this point, and here he plays d6, which is often a move in the classical Dutch defense, but usually it comes later. So let's first of all take a look at some of these other moves here. c6 and d5 are ways to get to the stonewall with Dutch, which is a different kind of setup. So for example, c6, knight f3, and d5. And those moves can be played in the other order as well. d5 first, knight f3, then c6. And white gets this very solid pawn structure on the light squares. He does have to eventually find some way to develop this light squared bishop, but often this is a good attacking setup. And it was similar to what you saw in the game. Castles, king side, the queen steps to the side, and in this case, to get the bishop out from the pawn chain, it can sometimes make a route like this and get out on this diagonal. So it takes a few moves to develop the light squared bishop, but it's an interesting way to play, and it can lead to a quick attack on the king side. That's the Stonewall Dutch. So that would be these moves c6 and d5. Let's look at bishop e7. This is a way to continue in classical lines. And, well, knight c3 can be played here, or knight h3, but knight f3 is the main move. And then black castles and white castles and d6. So that's what I meant. This is the typical pawn structure setup in the classical Dutch. And notice that the knight has come out to f3. I played a different setup in the game. I played with pawn to e3, and the knight came out to e2 instead of going to f3, which is a different way of playing. It seems to be okay, but maybe this, actually, the knight on f3 is probably the strongest way to play. I just always worry about this pawn coming to f5. I've had some bad, or f4, the f5 pawn coming to f4. I've had some bad losses, and so I'm playing in a bit of a cautious fashion in this game. And so after he plays d6, indicating he's going for the classical, I went with e3 here. And that's just to set up this clamp on the f4 square, and the knight is coming to e2 to further reinforce that. So he's not getting in that pawn break. And it was probably perfectly safe for me to castle kingside in this position, but I was still a little bit worried about that. Let's back up. There was one other point I wanted to make there. Looking at this from the opening book. Yeah, the main move in the opening book, even here, is knight f3. So apparently there's nothing really to worry about, so I'm playing overly cautiously. And the other point I wanted to make is that because I went with e3 right at this move, it blocks off this bishop, which sometimes you might want to develop this bishop first, even perhaps trading off that knight there, which can be a strong piece before developing the pawns. So a lot of times these pawns will just stay back while white decides how to deploy the bishop, and then this knight can just come on out to f3. But as I said, that's not the way I'm playing it. I'm playing this other setup with pawn to e3, and we're just out of the opening book here. Let's see, he goes bishop e7, I go knight e2. Now I think white actually still has an opening advantage here, so I don't think it's too horrible what I played, but the other moves are probably better, honestly. So he castles here, I went knight bc3, and he went queen e8. So typical attacking idea, the queen comes here and can come out on the light squares to jump into the attack on the king side. And that made me even more reluctant to castle on the king side. But, well, we'll get to that in a minute. I delayed my decision and just played b3 here. Let's see, he went knight c6. Actually, the chess engine did not like knight c6 particularly. It preferred the knight coming out to a6 and the pawn going to c6, controlling all of these squares, and also introducing a certain flexibility. With the pawn on c6, black has the option of advancing with either the d pawn or the e pawn, depending on how he chooses to play it. And with the pawn on c6, the knight goes to a6 and comes back into the game via the c7 square if it can't find something useful to do on those squares. On b4 or c5, then it can come back to c7 and get into the game that way. So interesting way to play, and that's the preference of the chess engine. But he just went knight c6, very straightforward, putting pressure on the center. And here I played bishop a3, which was okay, but the chess engine prefers actually throwing in d5. And this knight needs to move, maybe going to e5 is a good square, and then bishop a3. So it actually liked that bishop a3 idea, but it wanted to throw in d5 first. And then black would play something like c6 to undermine, and it thinks that white still has an opening advantage here. Let's see, but after knight c6, I just went bishop a3 immediately. I'm keeping the knight out of the b4 square, and I'm looking to trade this bishop off against black's dark squared bishop. That's often a strong piece in this formation, particularly if he later decides to push this pawn and create that stonewall structure, which is still an option here. It's a bit slow at this point, but still a way that it could be played. Let's see, so I go bishop a3, he goes e5, so that indicates he's really not playing that way, and actually this is starting to open up his light squared bishop, so maybe there's not as much point in trading bishops, but yeah, so when I took, there's sort of encouraging the trade. The chess engine thinks I should really just castle instead and leave the tension in the center. One thing you do have to worry about is, say after castling, this pawn coming forward, it can make this bishop into a bad piece. But it does give up the f4 square for the knight, at least for a bit. Maybe g5 can come to chase it away at some point. Yeah, there's definitely pros and cons with a move like e4 to shut in the bishop. It does open up some squares. Anyway, instead of castling, I took. He took back, and I traded off the bishop. And maybe queen takes e7. Well, that's preferred by the chess engine over knight takes e7. There's actually a tactical problem with this one. After knight takes e7, I could have played knight b5. It's kind of an annoying move. It's hitting this pawn, which is threatening to fork the queen and the rook. And at the same time, this bishop's diagonal has been opened up by the preceding moves. So after queen d7, I can trade queens here and grab that pawn. I suppose I could have grabbed the other pawn too. Anyway, this is not entirely clear-cut. There's an advantage to white here, but after the bishop retreats, he can trade off this knight. So it's a complicated, and grab a pawn. So it's still a complicated position, but it seems like white's a little better here. So taking with the knight here, I could have punished by playing knight b5. Anyway, that's a little complicated to see. I just played queen c2 here, preparing to bring my rook to the d file or castle queenside. I still hadn't committed to castling in either direction at this point. He played c6 here, and I did go ahead and castle queenside. And after this, yeah, that's probably a mistake. The chess engine here would still castle kingside. He has brought a few pieces over, but there is not yet an overwhelming attack here. I'm pretty well set up for the defense. And whereas on the queen side, my king is actually a bit weak here, and he starts to exploit that pretty quickly. So probably the king would have been safer on the king side, but we do get into a position which is somewhat unique here. Not a typical Dutch position at all. So he continued with bishop e6, just protecting his king along this diagonal, and well, protecting the diagonal that goes towards his king, and also maybe putting some pressure on my pawns. He has ideas of pushing his queenside pawns forward and creating some more weaknesses here. I step up with the king, so my rooks have mobility back here to defend, and also I'm defending these pawns. And he pushes on immediately with a5. Although the chess engine would at this point be looking to the king side and would play knight to g4. And that's kind of an annoying move. It's looking at this fork here, taking on f2 and forking, and I have to actually play knight to c1. Well, knight to c1 is apparently the best defense. Defend it with the queen, and then maybe the knight reroutes somewhere else. Interesting. Yeah, it's kind of funny. You would think it's pretty natural in this position where we've castled on opposite sides that black would immediately launch a pawn storm against my king. So it's a very natural move, but it's a position where the chess engine actually would prefer to play on the king side, which also makes sense if you look at the distribution of black's pieces. He's got them all over there on the king side, so you know, play where you're stronger, and maybe you can just win material over here on the king side if he puts his mind to it. Anyway, he played a5, and I pushed in the center with e4. And it didn't really like this, although it didn't have any great alternatives. It was suggesting maybe h3. Well, it puts a stop to the knight g4 idea at least. But I wanted to open things up, maybe incorrectly. So you don't want to open things up when it's going to work against you, when it's going to backfire. But seemed to work okay, but I suppose that required the cooperation of my opponent to a certain extent. So after e4, he could just take and then continue on with a4. This is a line that's liked by the chess engine for black. Anyway, instead, after e4, he played queen f7. So he's getting some more pressure along this diagonal. Now you can see the idea. This pawn could come here. Maybe this pawn can come here. And he's just going to chip away at these light squared pawns using this battery and his rook. And the queen is also on the king side defending, so his king is pretty safe here. Anyway, I pushed on with f4. I could have taken. He takes f5 is maybe a little better. Bishop takes, and then queen d2 was given as an improvement by the chess engine. But I just wanted to open things up and get my rooks into the game. And here he played b5. So continuing with his plan of just assaulting my king over here. But once again, knight g4 would have been a good idea. So anyway, the game went b5. He took, and I played f takes e5. He did just leave this pawn hanging, but this is not bad. Black is still okay here. I think the evaluation has kind of been shifting back and forth, but I think we're still in the range of around even, so it's still anybody's game at this point. Now he goes knight g4. And yeah, this is an interesting move. The knight g4 also has the idea of jumping into e3 with a fork here against my a fork against my queen and my rook. But I went ahead and took here, and he doesn't have time. I checked this out later. If he throws in knight e3 now, I can actually take the bishop because I'm hitting his queen. So it doesn't matter that he's threatening my queen. I threaten his queen first. And then I can save my queen and get I get 2 pieces for the rook. And I'm in good shape there, actually. White is winning in that line. So he has to take back. And then I move my queen to the side, and now there's no fork anymore. In fact, I'm controlling the e3 square. So he continued with rook a to c8. He's got ideas. This is pretty dangerous looking as well. The bishop and the rook are coordinating on the c2 square, and he's just going to push this pawn forward to drive my knight out of the way, and I come in here and fork the king and the queen, and that would be winning for black. But I don't have to put up with that. I have ways to defend against this, and I wanted to bring a rook to the f file to pin that bishop as part of dealing with that. And then I wanted to play knight to d4, pin the bishop and then attack it. Actually, the strongest move here is to play knight d4 first. That's the chess engine's preference. And then it also says if I am going to move a rook, I should move the h rook. There's a problem with moving the d rook away, so it's worth actually, that sacrifices a pawn here. It says it's worth sacrificing a pawn because you're still going to get knight to d4 in there. So anyway, that's the chess engine point of view. I brought the other rook over because I didn't see why I should be giving up a pawn. Didn't quite understand why keeping a rook on the d file was so important. And here he went ahead and took. But, well, what he could have played here, which would have been strong, is rook f to d8, hitting my queen, forcing it off that d file, maybe coming out to f4, and then continuing on with b4. And now he's breaking through. I could play, well, he's not breaking through. I can play knight e4, but it's getting a little bit awkward here. He's got this pin on the knight because I don't want to give up that I don't want to give up that c2 square and allow a rook to come in there. The knight is also guarding d2. So we could probably break through with a combination of rook d2 followed by rook to c2. Looks pretty dangerous. But it's a complicated position. Anything could happen there. But the chess engine thinks that favors black. Instead, he just took the pawn here. So we're back to material equality. He'd given that pawn up earlier. And I went knight d4 now, which was part of my plan. This attacks the pinned bishop. It also guards against a rook coming into the c2 square. So it's a good move, even here. And let's see, he played knight d3 check. Once again, rook f to d8 would have been a strong move there. Just counterattacking or pinning my knight on the d file there. Would have been an awkward position for white. Anyway, he played knight d3 check. And this seems to be about even. And I dropped my king back, and then he played b4. So b4 is classified as a mistake by the chess engine and thinks queen f6 should be played. Yeah, it starts to, he's opened up this diagonal here when he plays b4. When did that diagonal open up? Let's back up a little bit. Yeah, this diagonal has been open for a while. So this threat that ends the game later is kind of in the position. Of course, that square is guarded by his knight. So that d5 square is key. So I guess it's not all over yet here. Let's go forward again. He took on e5. I played knight d4. I played knight d3 check and dropped the king back. And he played b4. And yeah, at this point, the chess engine thinks that black is losing. So let's see. I played knight takes f5. That keeps the win. He takes back. I guess that's it. When I play knight takes f5 and he has to take back with the knight, now this tactic is open. I was a little bit worried about the counterattack here, and so actually my next move is a mistake. I should play bishop d5 immediately, and I was already aware of this move and during the game, but I thought I should take care of this problem with pawn takes knight first. But I can just play this way. Bishop to d5. He plays b takes c3. You know, it attacks my queen and undefends the bishop, but it's my turn to move here, and I get to take with check. So I can just take it, and then I can take the knight. And that is the simplest win there. Instead, I took the knight first, and he could defend here. So here, and I was expecting this rook takes c3 move. After I played it, I noticed he could just take with the rook. And after this, the best I have is queen d5. Now, it turns out the chess engine still likes white in this position, so I have maybe some kind of edge in the endgame. It would go like this. Well, the king steps aside to unpin. I have nothing better than to trade, and then I can play g4 to kick the knight. Now the knight needs to move, and it's got to keep that rook defended, so it could go either here or to h6. It doesn't matter, because I'm going to take and play rook to f1. And it seems, you know, it looks like an even material endgame with a bishop versus a knight. But there's some, and it also looks like my king is locked out of the game by his rook, which I can't really challenge his rook very easily on that square. But there are some difficulties here. This knight can't move at the moment. Sorry, the knight can't move at the moment because there's a back rank threat. If the king comes over, then there is bishop to d5, pinning the knight. So it's a little bit of an awkward position for black, and the chess engine, although it doesn't show white winning a piece, it gives like a +1 or a little more advantage to white in this position. So it's an advantage where I have, it's an end game where I have some advantage. Hard to say how much or if it's winning, but that would be black's best chance. Instead, he just took the knight at this point. I guess he just overlooked this bishop d5 tactic that had been in the air, and he'd been defending against it until this exchange occurred on f5. But after this, he resigned. It was just game over at this point. No way to save his queen, and this pawn is too far away from queening, and I have the back rank well covered at this point in any case. So he didn't resign too soon. Anyway, a very interesting game, I thought. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you next time. Bye.